A policeman breaks into a church and arrests a black nun during the service, accusing her of aiding criminals. What he doesn't know is that her son is a police captain willing to go to any lengths to prove her innocence. Subscribe and watch the fight for justice unfold. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun barely crept over the horizon, casting soft amber hues onto the quiet streets of the neighborhood. Vera had been awake long before dawn, her mind gently shifting through the familiar rhythm of prayer. She moved quietly, almost in a meditative trance, as she readied herself for the morning service. The old church sat nestled in the heart of the small, largely African-American community, a sanctuary of peace amid the bustling, sometimes harsh reality that surrounded it. The church was Vera's home, her place of purpose, and today, as on every Sunday, it was a place of refuge for those seeking solace and guidance. Vera was a woman of few words when it came to herself, preferring instead to pour her energy into her work. Her journey here had not been easy. She'd traveled a winding road full of hardship and loss, but her faith had sustained her. The church walls echoed with memories of her struggles and triumphs, of the nights spent in quiet solitude, praying for the strength to continue. She paused before a cracked mirror in the small room beside the chapel, examining her own reflection. Her face, worn yet dignified, bore the marks of age, but her eyes retained the warmth and resolve that had carried her through the years. Stepping into the church, Vera moved along the wooden pews, adjusting the hymnals, her fingers grazing the well-worn covers as she checked to make sure each was in its place. The scent of old wood, mingled with the faint smell of beeswax candles, filled the room, creating an atmosphere of timeless reverence. She loved these quiet moments when she could feel the weight of the church's history resting on her shoulders. The neighborhood was tough, plagued by poverty and the injustices that seemed to cling to places like these. Unemployment was high, families struggled to make ends meet, and young people, facing limited opportunities, often found themselves entangled in the web of gang violence or the allure of the streets. But here, inside these walls, there was peace, a sanctuary from the harshness outside. Vera knew the faces and stories of each person who would walk through the door that morning. They came not just for the sermon, but for the community, for a sense of belonging, a place to be seen and heard. As the sun rose higher, the church began to fill. First came Mrs. Johnston, a widow in her late 70s, with her walking cane tapping gently against the stone floor as she entered. She gave Vera a smile that spoke of shared history and silent understanding. Then came Michael, a teenager with a troubled expression and a guarded posture. Vera had known him since he was a child, had watched as life chipped away at his innocence. Recently, she'd noticed a new worry in his eyes, the weight of decisions he wasn't ready to make. More people filed in, and each received a warm greeting from Vera. There was Tasha, a single mother clutching her young son, and Mr. Davis, a Vietnam veteran whose haunted eyes betrayed the pain he carried. Vera's heart swelled with empathy as she greeted each of them. They were her family, each carrying burdens of their own, yet coming together, seeking the strength to face another week. Finally, the room quieted as Vera took her place at the front, glancing at the faces before her. She felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, a sense of purpose that renewed her resolve. Taking a deep breath, she began her sermon, her voice soft but steady, carrying a wisdom that resonated deeply with the congregation. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her words filling the small chapel with a gentle authority, We live in a world that tests us every day. Sometimes we feel alone, misunderstood, or even abandoned. But let us not forget that we are never truly alone. We have each other. We have our faith, our community. The sermon was not long, but every word carried weight. Vera spoke about hope, about the strength to endure, to face the darkness with unwavering belief in the light that each of them carried within. She reminded them that their worth wasn't defined by their circumstances, that they were loved and valued. She saw the impact of her words on their faces, a brief flicker of relief, of comfort. After the service, Vera remained at the front as the congregation began to approach her one by one, seeking advice, comfort, and blessings. Tasha, the young mother, came forward, her son clinging to her side. "Sister Vera," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just don't know how I'm going to make it this month. They cut my hours at work and I'm barely scraping by as it is." Vera placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, looking her straight in the eyes. "Tasha, you're not alone in this. We're here for you. Have you thought about taking up some shifts at the community center? They're always in need of extra hands, and it might help until things settle down." Tasha nodded, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'll look into it." "Thank you, Sister Vera." Michael, the young teenager, lingered at the back, shifting uneasily as he watched others talk to Vera. She noticed him and called him forward with a gentle smile. "Michael, how have you been?" she asked, her tone inviting. He shrugged, not meeting her eyes. It's fine, I guess." Vera could see through the facade, sensing the struggle within him. "You know, it's okay to talk about what's troubling you, Michael. You don't have to carry it alone." After a moment, he looked up, his gaze finally meeting hers. "It's just, the guys in the neighborhood, they keep telling me I should join them. They say it's the only way to get respect." Vera nodded, understanding the pressures he faced. "Michael, true respect isn't something you get from others by force. It's something you earn by living with integrity. You're strong, and you have a choice. Remember, this place is always open to you, no matter what." They shared a long look, and Vera hoped that her words had reached him, even if only a little. Michael gave a slight nod, and as he walked away, Vera silently prayed for his safety. As the morning drew on, Vera continued to offer words of encouragement and guidance to each person who sought her out. She felt an immense gratitude for the role she played in their lives, but at the same time, she sensed the weight of their pain pressing on her heart. Despite her unwavering faith, there were moments when she too felt the darkness creeping in, questioning if her efforts were enough. Finally, as the last of the congregation departed, Vera sat in one of the pews, allowing herself a moment of solitude. She closed her eyes, silently praying, drawing strength from her faith. Her mind wandered to her son, James, the boy she had raised with love and hope. He had become a man of principle, a police officer determined to bring about positive change. But his work kept him distant, and she hadn't seen him in weeks. She missed him, missed the way his presence brought a sense of balance to her life. And yet, she understood his struggle, for it was the same one she faced here every day, a fight for justice, for compassion, in a world that seemed intent on testing their resolve. The church was empty now, bathed in the warm glow of afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows. Vera remained seated, her fingers intertwined as she prayed, her thoughts drifting between her congregation, her son, and the uncertain future that awaited them all. Little did she know this moment of calm was only the prelude to a storm that would shake the very foundation of her life and challenge everything she believed in. The morning service had ended, and the last of the congregation members trickled out of the church, their faces softened with the peace they found in Vera's words. The sun now hung high in the sky, casting its golden warmth over the small, worn building. Vera moved about the chapel, tidying up hymnals and straightening pews, humming quietly to herself, her heart filled with the steady calm of her faith. She enjoyed this quiet time, these rare moments alone in the sanctuary, where she could reflect and feel the presence of peace settle around her. But that peace was shattered without warning. The sudden, harsh clang of the church doors swinging open startled her, echoing through the empty space like the ominous toll of a bell. Vera turned to see a group of uniformed officers standing at the entrance, their faces obscured by the glare of daylight streaming in from behind them. At the forefront stood a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a cold, rigid expression, Officer Harrison. The congregation often spoke of Officer Harrison, and rarely with fondness. He was known for his heavy-handed tactics and, more disturbingly, for a deep-seated bias against the black community. Rumors of his prejudiced behavior and questionable methods were whispered in hushed tones, stories of rough encounters and abuse of power. Vera had always hoped to avoid crossing paths with him, though she'd never imagined he would one day step into her church. "Vera Marshall?" Harrison's voice was sharp, grating, echoing through the sanctuary with a sense of authority that bordered on hostility. He scanned the room with cold, calculating eyes, as if daring anyone to question his presence. Vera stood tall, her back straight, meeting his gaze with a calmness that belied the unease now bubbling inside her. "Yes, I am Vera Marshall," she replied, her tone steady and composed, though her heart raced with sudden trepidation. Without preamble, Harrison marched forward, his boots thudding against the church floor, an audible sign of his disregard for the sanctity of the space. He stopped just a few feet from her, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. Behind him, his fellow officers watched, some with expressions of discomfort, others with thinly veiled indifference. "We have a warrant for your arrest," Harrison declared, holding up a piece of paper with an air of satisfaction. His voice carried a note of contempt, as if he found joy in delivering this message. Words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Vera felt a chill run down her spine. Arrest? She could scarcely believe what she was hearing, but she held her composure, refusing to let the shock show on her face. "There must be some mistake," she said calmly. "I don't understand what I'm being accused of." Harrison's lips twisted into a sneer. "Oh, there's no mistake, Miss Marshall. We have credible evidence linking you to embezzlement and conspiracy to aid known criminals. You've been using this church as a front to line your own pockets, and we're putting an end to it." A murmur of disbelief rose from the back of the church, where a few of the lingering congregation members had gathered to watch the commotion. Tasha, the young mother Vera had comforted that morning, gasped, her hands covering her mouth in horror. Michael, the troubled teenager, looked on with wide eyes, his face a mixture of fear and anger. Vera's heart ached as she saw the reactions of her congregation, the confusion and betrayal mirrored in their eyes. She could hardly believe what she was hearing herself. These were baseless accusations, lies that threatened to undo years of work, of dedication to her community. "Harrison," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm, "you know these charges aren't true. I've given my life to this community. I have nothing to hide." But Harrison only laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed through the silent chapel. "Save your breath. I don't want to hear your excuses." He reached out, grabbing her arm with a roughness that bordered on aggression. Pain shot through Vera's wrist as his grip tightened, But she refused to flinch, standing her ground with a dignity that seemed to only provoke him further. Harrison's eyes glinted with satisfaction as he pulled her forward, his grip unyielding, as if he relished this display of power. "Please, let go of her," a voice cried out from the congregation. It was Mrs. Johnston, the elderly widow, her frail hands reaching out in a futile attempt to intervene. But Harrison shoved her back, barely sparing her a glance. "Stay out of this," he barked, casting a disdainful look over the gathered onlookers. "Anyone who interferes will be arrested on the spot." The room fell into an uneasy silence, thick with fear and helplessness. Tasha clutched her son tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. Michael's hands were clenched into fists, his face a storm of anger and frustration. Vera felt the stinging burn of humiliation as Harrison twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to her knees. She could feel the weight of her congregation's gaze, their sorrow and disbelief piercing her like needles. But she refused to give in to despair. Inwardly, she recited a quiet prayer, drawing strength from her faith, even as Harrison clamped the cold metal of handcuffs around her wrists. As he yanked her to her feet, Vera looked up, meeting the gaze of each person gathered there. She wanted them to see her strength, to know that she was not afraid, that she would endure whatever was to come. Her eyes met Michael's, and she saw the anguish in his young face, the struggle to understand why this was happening. "Remember what I told you, Michael," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried through the stillness of the room. "Stay true to yourself. Don't let anyone lead you down a path you don't believe in." The boy's face crumpled, his shoulders trembling with restrained anger. He took a step forward, as if to intervene, but Vera shook her head, giving him a small, sad smile. This was not a battle he could fight for her. Harrison jerked her forward, his grip unrelenting, and began leading her toward the exit. As they passed through the pews, Vera cast one last look at her beloved church, the place that had been her refuge and her purpose for so many years. She felt a pang of grief, wondering if she would ever see it again, if she would ever be able to return to the life she had built here. As they reached the door, Tasha called out, her voice thick with tears. "This isn't right. She's a good woman. She's done nothing wrong." Harrison ignored her, pushing Vera forward with a callous indifference. They stepped out into the harsh daylight, where a police cruiser awaited them, its flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the quiet street. Vera stood tall, refusing to let the weight of the handcuffs or the sneers of the onlookers break her spirit. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that she would face challenges unlike any she had ever known, but her faith remained unshaken, a steady flame burning within her, illuminating the darkness that sought to consume her. As Harrison shoved her into the back of the cruiser, she offered one last silent prayer, not for herself, but for her congregation, for the people who would be left behind to carry the weight of her absence. She prayed that they would find the strength to hold on, to remember the lessons she had taught them, to keep faith in the face of adversity. The door slammed shut, sealing her in, and as the cruiser pulled away from the church, Vera closed her eyes, preparing herself for the trials that lay ahead. The drive to the police station was a silent journey, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the police radio. Vera sat in the back of the cruiser, her wrists restrained, her body bruised from Harrison's rough treatment, yet her spirit remained unbroken. She kept her gaze steady, her expression calm, though inwardly she prayed for the strength to face whatever was to come. When they arrived at the station, Harrison yanked her out of the car with little regard for her age or dignity, dragging her through the cold, sterile corridors. The other officers looked on, some with apathy, others with unease, though none dared intervene. Harrison's reputation for ruthlessness was well known. Challenging him meant risking one's own position in the department. As Vera was led through the station, she could feel the weight of the building pressing down on her, the walls seeming to absorb and radiate the collective despair of everyone who had ever passed through them. The cold fluorescence of the lights overhead only added to the oppressive atmosphere, casting harsh shadows across her face as she was taken deeper into the building. Finally, they reached a small, dimly lit interrogation room. Harrison shoved her inside, the door clanging shut behind him with a metallic finality. The room was stark, its only furnishings a metal table bolted to the floor and two hard chairs. The walls were bare, save for a single mirror on one side, reflecting back a distorted version of the scene, as if to amplify the isolation and unease that filled the space. Harrison circled her slowly, his presence predatory. His eyes narrowed in satisfaction as he regarded her like a prize finally caught. He took his time, letting the silence build, clearly intending to intimidate her. But Vera remained seated, her gaze calm, her posture upright. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. He finally sat down across from her, folding his arms with a smug smile. "Let's not waste any time, Vera," he sneered. "I want you to come clean about everything. We both know you've been hiding things." Vera looked back at him, her gaze unwavering. "Officer Harrison, I've done nothing wrong. I have dedicated my life to helping my community, to giving hope where it's needed. These accusations, they're baseless." Harrison's smile faded, replaced by a hard, cold glare. He leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "You can drop the act. I know what you are. A con artist using the church as a front to line your pockets to protect criminals? Don't think for a second that your little saintly image fools me." The accusations struck her like a physical blow, but Vera held her ground, refusing to flinch. She clasped her hands together on the table, drawing strength from her faith, silently reciting a prayer as she steeled herself against his words. "I'm not a criminal," she replied, her voice steady. "Everything I do for the people who come to my church. They come seeking guidance, comfort, and hope. I give them what I can." Harrison's fists clenched and he slammed one onto the table with a loud, resounding bang. "Enough!" he barked, his face twisting in anger. "Do you think you're better than the rest of us? Sitting in that church preaching your nonsense, acting like you're some kind of savior?" Vera took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "No, Officer Harrison, I don't think I'm better than anyone. I'm just a servant, trying to do good in a world that desperately needs it." The response only seemed to enrage him further. He stood up abruptly, towering over her, his face contorted with barely restrained fury. "You're lying," he hissed, "and I'll prove it." With a swift movement, Harrison reached into a folder on the table, pulling out a stack of photographs and documents. He slapped them down in front of her, each image a stark black and white depiction of men from the neighborhood, men she recognized. Some were her congregation members, others were young men she had counseled, offering them food and shelter when no one else would. "These men," Harrison spat, tapping the photos with his finger, "are criminals, gang members, drug dealers, and you've been helping them." Vera looked down at the photographs, recognizing each face, each name, each story. She remembered their struggles, the hardships they faced, the ways the system had failed them. In her eyes, they were not criminals, but people in need of guidance and compassion. She had given them a safe space, a place where they could seek solace away from the judgment of a world that had already condemned them. They came to me for help, she replied quietly. For refuge? Yes, they may have made mistakes, but they're not beyond redemption. I believe in second chances, Officer Harrison. Everyone deserves one. Harrison sneered, crossing his arms. You're just making excuses for them. Harboring criminals, giving them shelter, that makes you an accomplice. You're protecting them, hiding them from justice. Justice? Vera's voice sharpened slightly, her calm facade cracking for the first time. You call this justice? Throwing people away, denying them the chance to rebuild their lives? I believe in redemption, officer. I believe in mercy. Harrison leaned in close, his face mere inches from hers. Mercy is for the weak, he growled. People like you enable these parasites, give them a sense of entitlement. Well, that ends now. The room fell into a tense silence, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Vera closed her eyes, centering herself, her mind drifting to memories of the people she had helped, the lives she had seen transformed through kindness and faith. She thought of Tasha, of Michael, of the countless others who had walked through her church doors seeking solace. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft yet unwavering. What you call weakness, I call strength. It takes strength to forgive, to give someone the chance to change. And no matter what happens here, no matter what you say, I will not abandon my beliefs. Harrison's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he searched her face, looking for any sign of fear or doubt, but he found none. Fine, he said finally, his voice dripping with contempt. Have it your way. We'll see how long that faith of yours lasts. He turned and called over his shoulder to a young officer standing outside the door. Take her to Holden. Let's see if a few nights in a cell will loosen her tongue. The young officer entered, looking uncomfortable as he approached Vera. He hesitated, glancing between her and Harrison, clearly torn. But under Harrison's cold stare, he finally took hold of Vera's arm, guiding her out of the room. As they walked down the narrow hallway toward the holding cells, Vera could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her, yet she held her head high, her gaze steady. She knew she was innocent, that she had done nothing wrong, but the road ahead was uncertain, and she could feel the beginning of a deep, looming struggle within her, a test of her faith and endurance. The holding cell was small, its walls bare and unforgiving, a place devoid of warmth or comfort. The officer closed the door behind her, the clang of metal echoing in the silent space. Vera sat on the cold bench, her hands folded in her lap, and took a deep breath, centering herself, letting her faith ground her in the face of despair. She knew the journey ahead would not be easy. She was facing an ordeal unlike any she had encountered before, a trial of both spirit and strength. But as she closed her eyes and recited a silent prayer, she felt a familiar calm settle over her heart. This was merely another challenge, another opportunity to prove the strength of her beliefs. And as long as she held on to her faith, she knew that she would endure. James sat at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork scattered before him, his mind a tangled web of exhaustion and frustration. The precinct was quieter than usual, an uneasy hush that seemed to hang over the place. He rubbed his temples, trying to dispel the dull ache that had taken residence there over the past few days. It had been weeks since he'd last seen his mother, Vera, and a gnawing sense of guilt was beginning to unsettle him. He had meant to visit her, to stop by the church and listen to her soothing voice, to share a meal and talk about the things that mattered to her. But time had slipped through his fingers, buried under endless shifts, reports, and the unrelenting chaos that seemed to define his work. Now, the memory of her soft smile, her warm embrace, felt like a distant comfort he could barely grasp. The ringing of his phone jolted him back to the present, cutting through the quiet. He reached for it, glancing at the screen. It was one of his colleagues, Officer Lopez, a man he had known for years and trusted implicitly. "Lopez," he answered, his tone weary. "What's going on?" "James, there's something you need to see," Lopez replied, his voice tense. "It's about your mother." The words hit James like a cold wave, a chill spreading through him. "My mother? What do you mean?" Lopez hesitated, and in that moment, James's stomach dropped. They arrested her, James. She's being held at the station. They brought her in this morning." The news hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him, leaving him unsteady and disoriented. His mother? Vera? The thought was incomprehensible, a cruel twist of reality that he could barely process. What are the charges?" he managed to ask, his voice strained. "Embezzlement, aiding criminals. Harrison's the one leading the case against her." James's hands clenched, his knuckles whitening as he tried to rein in his shock and anger. Harrison. Of course, it had to be him. James had known the man for years, had seen firsthand the arrogance and prejudice that defined him. Harrison was known for his ruthless approach to law enforcement, a man who took pleasure in asserting his authority, often with little regard for justice. "Lopez, this has to be a mistake," James said, his voice low, seething. "My mother has never broken a law in her life. She's the most honest person I know." "I believe you," Lopez replied, his voice filled with quiet sympathy. "But you know Harrison. Once he sets his sights on someone, he doesn't back down. He's convinced he's got her dead to rights." A surge of anger surged through James, a fierce, protective rage that he struggled to contain. His mother was not a criminal. She was a pillar of their community, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, to providing a safe space for people who had nowhere else to turn. "I'm coming down there," he said, barely managing to keep his voice steady. "Thanks for letting me know, Lopez." He hung up without waiting for a reply, his mind racing as he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. The walk through the precinct felt surreal, his colleagues' faces blurring as he moved with single-minded determination. He barely registered the quiet murmurs, the sidelong glances. All he could think about was his mother, alone in a cell, facing accusations that he knew were false. When he arrived at the holding area, he was met with the sight he had been dreading. Vera sitting on a cold metal bench behind bars, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze calm but distant. She looked tired, but there was a quiet strength in her posture, a resilience that James recognized as her way of enduring hardship. "Mom," he called softly, stepping closer to the bars. She looked up, her face lighting up with a brief flicker of relief. "James," she murmured, rising to her feet. Despite everything, she managed a gentle smile, the same smile that had comforted him countless times throughout his life. James took a shaky breath, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "Mom, I just heard. I came as soon as I could." Vera reached through the bars, placing a reassuring hand on his. "It's all right, James. I'm so glad you're here. But these charges," he stammered, anger flaring anew. "Harrison is accusing you of embezzlement, of aiding criminals. This is insane." Vera's gaze softened, a sadness settling in her eyes. I know it sounds unbelievable, but Harrison, he's determined to find fault, even if it means twisting the truth. James gritted his teeth, his hands tightening around the cold metal of the bars. This is beyond wrong, Mom. I can't believe they would do this to you. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. I know, son, but I'm not afraid. I have faith that the truth will come out. This is just another test, one that we'll face together. He looked at her, his heart aching with a mixture of love and fury. I won't let them get away with this. I'll find out what Harrison's up to, and I'll make sure he pays for this. Vera's face softened, and she shook her head gently. James, don't let anger consume you. That's not who you are. He took a deep breath, nodding reluctantly. She was right, of course, but he couldn't simply stand by and watch his mother be railroaded by a corrupt system. He had to act, to do something, to find a way to expose Harrison's lies. Let me talk to some people, he said, his voice steady with resolve. I'll get to the bottom of this, I promise. She smiled, a hint of pride in her eyes. I know you will, James. I've always believed in you. As he turned to leave, her words lingered in his mind, a reminder of the values she had instilled in him. He had joined the force to protect and serve, to bring justice to those who had none. But now, faced with the bitter irony of the system turning against his own family, he realized just how fragile that sense of justice could be. James left the Holden area, his thoughts a whirlwind of plans and strategies. He knew he couldn't confront Harrison directly. Not yet. He needed proof, something solid to dismantle the case against his mother. But the question was where to start, and who he could trust in a department filled with people who either feared or supported Harrison. As he walked back through the precinct, he caught sight of a familiar face, Officer Carter, a quiet but observant man who had joined the force around the same time as James. They had shared countless shifts, and though they weren't close friends, James had always respected Carter's integrity. He approached him, keeping his voice low. Carter, can we talk? Carter looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Of course, James. What's going on? James hesitated, then plunged forward. It's about my mother. Harrison's accusing her of embezzlement and aiding criminals, and I know it's all lies. I need help to prove it. Carter's expression darkened, and he glanced around cautiously before nodding. Let's step outside. This isn't something we want overheard. They walked out into the cold night air, finding a secluded spot where they could talk without fear of eavesdroppers. Carter turned to James, his face serious. I don't trust Harrison, Carter admitted, his voice quiet but firm. He's always had his own agenda, and it's never been about justice. But going against him, that's risky, James. I know, James replied, his jaw set. But he's targeting my mother. I can't stand by and do nothing. Carter regarded him for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll see what I can dig up, but you have to be careful, James. If Harrison catches wind of this, he'll come after both of us. James nodded, gratitude flooding him. Thank you, Carter. I owe you one. Carter gave a small, grim smile. Just make sure we get the truth out there. It's about time someone stood up to him. They parted ways, and James returned to his apartment, his mind racing with the possibilities. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Harrison was a powerful figure in the precinct, and taking him down would require more than a few rumors. He needed hard evidence, something undeniable. As he lay in bed that night, sleep eluding him, James thought about his mother's unwavering faith, her strength in the face of adversity. He knew that she would endure whatever came her way with grace, but he also knew that he couldn't let her fight this battle alone. He would uncover the truth. No matter the cost, he would protect her, and he would ensure that justice, real justice, was served. James spent the next several days in a relentless pursuit of the truth. Every spare moment outside of his shifts was spent poring over case files, digging into Harrison's past records, and questioning anyone who might have a lead. He kept his investigations discreet, knowing that even the slightest hint of his actions could bring unwanted attention from Harrison or his allies. Yet, as each hour passed, his sense of urgency grew. His mother was counting on him, and he couldn't afford any missteps. Late one evening, just as he was about to leave for the night, James's phone buzzed with a message from Carter. "I found something. Meet me outside in 5. James's heart raced as he pocketed his phone and made his way to the station's back exit. Stepping out into the chilly night air, he spotted Carter waiting near the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden in the shadows. As he approached, Carter handed him a manila envelope, his expression grim. "I had to pull some strings for this," Carter whispered. "If anyone finds out, we're both finished." James took the envelope, nodding in silent gratitude. "I understand. Thank you, Carter. I owe you for this." "Just be careful," Carter replied, glancing around nervously. "Harrison's not the type to go down quietly." With a final nod, Carter turned and walked away, leaving James alone with the envelope. He looked down at it, his pulse quickening as he wondered what secrets it might contain. Moving quickly, he returned to his car and locked the doors, flipping on the interior light to examine the documents inside. The contents were damning. The envelope contained evidence of Harrison's involvement in a scheme that went far beyond simple misconduct. There were records of falsified reports, instances of excessive force that had been swept under the rug, and, most disturbingly, a paper trail connecting him to a series of bribes from local gang leaders. It appeared that Harrison had been manipulating arrests, using his position to control certain criminal activities in the area while simultaneously framing innocent individuals to maintain the appearance of a successful crackdown. As James scanned the documents, his anger grew. His mother was one of those innocent individuals, a victim of Harrison's twisted sense of justice and his insatiable need for control. This evidence was the key to exposing Harrison's corruption, to clearing his mother's name and finally bringing some semblance of justice to the precinct. Without hesitating, James gathered the documents and headed back inside, determined to confront Harrison directly. He knew it was a risky move. Harrison was powerful, with connections and influence that extended beyond the walls of the station. But James was past the point of caution. His mother's reputation, her life, was on the line, and he would not allow this man to go unchallenged. He found Harrison in his office, his feet propped up on his desk as he scrolled through his phone, looking every bit the self-satisfied, untouchable figure he prided himself on being. The sight filled James with a renewed sense of purpose, and he knocked sharply on the doorframe, drawing Harrison's attention. "James," Harrison drawled, lowering his feet and setting his phone aside. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" James stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He held up the envelope, his gaze cold and unflinching. "We need to talk, Harrison." Harrison raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of amusement and suspicion. "Oh? And what exactly do you think we need to talk about?" James placed the envelope on the desk and folded his arms, staring down at Harrison. "About the lies, the corruption, and the abuse of power. I know what you've been doing, Harrison. I have proof. For a brief moment, a flicker of alarm crossed Harrison's face, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. Proof? Of what, exactly? Of your involvement with the gangs, your manipulation of cases, and your decision to frame innocent people, like my mother, to cover your tracks. James's voice was steady, each word laced with quiet fury. It's over, Harrison. You won't be able to hide behind your badge anymore. Harrison's expression darkened, his jaw clenching as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a barely restrained rage. You don't know what you're talking about, boy. You're just a rookie trying to play hero. James shook his head, holding his ground. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And you know what's even better? So will Internal Affairs when they see this. He gestured to the envelope. It's all here, Harrison. Every dirty deal, every cover-up. You've built your career on lies, and it's all coming down. Harrison laughed, though there was no humor in it. You think Internal Affairs is going to listen to you? You're nobody, James. Just a kid with a misplaced sense of justice. You can't take me down. James met his gaze, unflinching. Maybe I am just a kid to you, Harrison. But I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not going to let you destroy any more lives. The two men stood in silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. James could feel the weight of his words settling over the room, a challenge that he knew Harrison would not take lightly. But he was prepared for whatever came next. He had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back. Harrison's gaze turned cold, his lips curling into a cruel smile. You think you're some kind of crusader, don't you? Just like your mother. So righteous, so pure. He sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. But let me tell you something, James. People like her, people like you, you're weak. You cling to your morals, your faith, thinking it makes you strong. But this world doesn't reward strength. It rewards power. James felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure, his gaze steady. Power, built on lies, is nothing but an illusion, Harrison, and that illusion is about to come crashing down. Harrison rose from his chair, stepping around the desk until he was standing just inches away from James, his expression twisted with barely restrained hatred. You're making a big mistake, boy. If you go through with this, I'll make sure you regret it. You think you're protecting your mother. All you're doing is painting a target on her back. James refused to be intimidated. I'm not afraid of you, and neither is she. We've both faced worse than you. Harrison's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, the door to his office swung open. Carter stood in the doorway, his face set with determination. It's over, Harrison, Carter said, his voice steady. Internal Affairs is waiting. They want to talk to you. And trust me, they're very interested in what's in that envelope. Harrison's face drained of color, his bravado faltering as he realized the weight of the situation. For the first time, James saw fear in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that betrayed the truth he had fought so hard to bury. He glanced between James and Carter, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came. Finally, with a defeated growl, he pushed past them, storming out of the office and down the hall toward the waiting officers from Internal Affairs. As he disappeared from sight, James felt a surge of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had finally turned. Harrison's downfall was inevitable, and with it, the false charges against his mother would be dismissed. Justice, though delayed, was finally within reach. Carter placed a hand on James's shoulder, giving him a nod of approval. You did the right thing, James. It takes courage to stand up to people like him. James managed a faint smile, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without your help, Carter. Thank you." Carter shrugged, a small, proud smile tugging at his lips. "Your mother's a good woman. She deserves better than what Harrison put her through. We all do." They stood in silence for a moment, each reflecting on the weight of the day's events. James's thoughts drifted to his mother, to the strength she had shown even in the face of injustice. He knew that her faith had been the anchor that kept her steady, that had given him the strength to fight for the truth. As they walked out of the precinct together, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but he had won a crucial battle. His mother's name would be cleared, and Harrison's reign of corruption would come to an end. In that moment, James knew that he was no longer just fighting for his mother. He was fighting for every person in his community, for every innocent life that had been touched by injustice. And he would not rest until they all received the justice they deserved. The day of Vera's release was bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed to hold a promise of hope. James arrived at the courthouse early, his heart racing with anticipation. The past few weeks had been an exhausting battle, but as he stood on the courthouse steps, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The evidence he and Carter had presented to Internal Affairs had not only cleared his mother's name, but had also exposed a network of corruption that reached far beyond Harrison. As he waited, the doors of the courthouse opened, and Vera appeared, escorted by a sympathetic officer. The moment James saw her, a flood of emotions washed over him: relief, gratitude, and a fierce pride in the woman who had taught him everything about strength and resilience. She looked tired, her face lined with the strain of the ordeal, but her eyes held the same calm determination he had always known. "Mom," he called, striding forward. Vera's face softened, and a smile spread across her lips as she reached out to embrace him. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in a quiet embrace, finding comfort in each other's presence. For James, it was a moment of triumph, not just for him but for both of them, a testament to the power of truth and integrity. "James," Vera whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I knew you'd come through." He pulled back, meeting her gaze. "You were the one who taught me to stand up for what's right, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." They walked down the courthouse steps together, a sense of peace settling over them. It felt as though the weight of the past weeks had finally lifted, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of justice served. The community had gathered to welcome Vera back, friends and neighbors who had stood by her throughout the ordeal. They cheered as she approached, their voices filled with admiration and relief. As she reached the bottom of the steps, Tasha, the young mother from the church, stepped forward, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Sister Vera, we're so glad you're home. We never stopped believing in you." Vera smiled, taking Tasha's hands in hers. "Thank you, Tasha. Your faith has been a blessing to me." Michael, the troubled teenager she had counseled so often, hung back, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his face a mixture of shame and admiration. Vera caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod, beckoning him forward. "Michael," she said softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's good to see you." He looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Sister Vera. I didn't know if you'd want to see me after everything that happened." She shook her head, her expression gentle. "Everyone makes mistakes, Michael. What matters is what you choose to do next." His gaze met hers, and for the first time James saw a spark of hope in the boy's eyes. Michael nodded, a determined look settling on his face. Thank you. I won't forget this." As the crowd dispersed, Vera and James made their way back to the church. The small building stood as it always had, a humble sanctuary nestled in the heart of the community. But today it felt different, as though it had absorbed the strength of the people who had gathered to support Vera. Inside, Vera took her place at the pulpit, the familiar surroundings filling her with a sense of peace. She looked out at the congregation, her heart swelling with gratitude for each person who had believed in her, who had stood by her side even when the world seemed to turn against her. "Today," she began, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had faced darkness and emerged stronger, "I want to speak about forgiveness, about the power it holds to heal and to restore." She paused, letting the words sink in. The room was silent. Every face turned toward her, each person hanging on her every word. "There will always be those who seek to harm us, who will try to tear us down because of their own fear and hatred," she continued. "But forgiveness is a choice that allows us to rise above the hurt and the anger. It does not excuse the wrongs done to us, but it frees us from being held captive by them." James watched his mother with a renewed sense of respect, his heart swelling with pride. Her strength, her grace, she was a beacon of hope, not just for him but for everyone who had come to her seeking solace and guidance. She was unbroken, unbowed, and her words were a balm for the wounds that had been inflicted. As the congregation began to disperse, Vera took a moment to sit in one of the pews, her gaze resting on the familiar stained glass windows that filled the room with a gentle, colorful light. James joined her, sitting beside her in silence. "What happens now, Mom?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Now we move forward. We continue to serve, to build this community, to bring hope where it's needed most." James nodded, feeling a newfound clarity. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time for me to make a change too. This experience has shown me just how broken the system is, and I can't be part of something that allows people like Harrison to thrive. I want to do something meaningful, something that truly helps people." Vera placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile warm and encouraging. "You have a good heart, James. I know you'll find your path, and whatever you choose, you'll make a difference. This community needs people like you." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his heart. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the badge, beyond the precinct. He wanted to be a part of something that aligned with the values his mother had instilled in him, a life dedicated to justice, compassion, and truth. In the weeks that followed, James made the decision to leave the police force. The choice wasn't easy. He had spent years building his career, driven by a desire to protect and serve. But now he understood that there were other ways to make a difference, ways that aligned more closely with his principles. With his mother's guidance, he began working with local community organizations, dedicating his time to youth outreach programs and initiatives aimed at reducing crime through support, not punishment. He saw firsthand the impact of his work, the lives he touched, and the hope he brought to those who had once felt abandoned. Vera, too, continued her work at the church, her spirit renewed, her faith unwavering. Together, she and James became a force for good in their community, a mother and son united by a shared mission to bring justice and compassion to a world that so often seemed devoid of both. And as they walked through the neighborhood, side by side, they knew that they were stronger together, bound by a love and a faith that could withstand even the darkest trials. Their journey had been painful, marked by betrayal and injustice, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond, a testament to the power of resilience, of truth, and of the enduring strength of family. As they looked to the future, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by the same unwavering belief that justice, compassion, and love would always prevail. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and share if you liked it. Write in the comments where you're watching us from. It's always interesting to find out.